The second the words came out of my mouth, I felt the air leave the room. Not dramatically. Not like in the movies where everyone gasps and turns to stare. It was quieter than that. Just a small, horrible silence where laughter used to be, and the sudden awareness that I had said something I could never take back. My name is Ethan, and this is the story of the stupidest thing I've ever said. The longest 6 months of my life, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, the best thing that ever happened to me. Before I get into it, if you've ever said something without thinking and watched it change everything, stay with me. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to Courage Stories, because this one took me years to have the courage to tell. It was 8 years ago. I was 24, living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Mississauga with a roommate I barely talked to, working part-time at a hardware store on Ontario while I tried to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I had signed up for a graphic design certificate at Sheridan, dropped out after 1 semester, picked it back up, dropped out again. I was the kind of person who had a lot of ideas and very little follow-through, and I knew it. And that knowledge sat in the back of my chest like something permanently undigested. My best friend was a guy named Spencer Holbrook. We had met in grade 8 in Brampton when his family moved into the house 2 streets over from mine, and somewhere between a shared hatred of gym class and too many hours playing video games in his basement, we became the kind of friends who don't really need to explain themselves to each other. Spencer was steady in the way I wasn't. He had a plan, worked toward it, landed a job in IT project management by the time we were 23. He never rubbed it in my face, which I think is one of the reasons we stayed close. Spencer lived with his mom, Lorraine Holbrook. His parents had divorced when he was 11, and his dad had moved out to British Columbia and remarried, and had 2 more kids and sent birthday cards sometimes. So it had been Spencer and Lorraine for a long time. She worked as a dental hygienist at a clinic in downtown Brampton, kept an immaculate house, made the best butter chicken I've ever had in my life, and somehow managed to hold all of it together with a kind of calm composure that I found both admirable and slightly intimidating. She was 46 at the time. She had Spencer when she was 22. I had been in and out of their house for over a decade by then. Lorraine knew how I took my coffee. I knew which drawer she kept the good scissors in. It was that kind of comfortable. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I had never thought about Lorraine in any way other than as Spencer's mom. I want to say that plainly, because what happened next might make it seem like there was something simmering underneath the whole time. And I genuinely don't think that's true. She was just a person I knew well and respected, the way you know and respect the furniture of your best friend's life. The night it happened was a Saturday in late October, one of those gray, wet Ontario evenings where the leaves had all turned, and half of them were already on the ground, and the sky got dark by 5 o'clock and stayed that way. Spencer and I had spent the afternoon watching football at his place. Lorraine had been out for most of the day at some kind of continuing education seminar for her clinic, and she'd come home around 6 with takeout from a Thai place on Queen Street, still in her work clothes, a burgundy blazer over dark jeans, her hair still done. She set the bags on the kitchen counter and poked her head into the living room to say hi, and Spencer immediately said something like, "Wow, going for the professional look on a Saturday?" In the teasing way he always spoke to her, and she laughed and said something back, and then she turned to head back to the kitchen, and I don't know what possessed me. I had been in a weird headspace that whole week. I had just broken up with a girl I'd been seeing for 4 months, or rather she had ended things with me, and I had been processing it with a specific kind of restless, self-deprecating humor that I defaulted to whenever I felt bad about myself. I was also, I'll admit, on my 3rd beer, and I said, without thinking, without pausing even half a second to consider the words, "No offense, Spencer, but your mom's better dressed than every girl I've ever dated." I meant it as a joke, or I thought I did. I meant it as that kind of set of self-deprecating humor where the joke is really about my own terrible track record, not about anything or anyone else. But the room went quiet. Spencer looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger exactly, not yet. More like he was trying to decide if I had actually just said what he thought I'd said. And then Lorraine stopped in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway. She looked at me for a moment, and I want to be honest about what I saw, because it stayed with me all these years. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't the polite freeze of someone who's heard something uncomfortable and is waiting for it to pass. It was something more considered than that. Like she had heard me, had turned the words over for one quiet second, and had decided on her response. She said, "Well, if you're ever interested in upgrading your standards, I'm free next Sunday." And then she walked down the hallway to her room. Spencer stared at the empty doorway for a long moment. Then he looked at me. I started laughing, the way you laugh when your body doesn't know what else to do, high and a little unhinged, and I said something like, "She's joking. Obviously, she's joking." And Spencer said, "Yeah," and turned back to the TV, but something had shifted. I could feel it. The room felt different in a way I couldn't name. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the night. I went home around 10, drove back to Mississauga in the rain, and told myself it was nothing, except I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not in a way I could make sense of, not at first. It was more like a stone dropped into still water, and I kept feeling the ripples without wanting to think about where they'd come from. Lorraine had said she was serious. She hadn't laughed. She just looked at me with those steady eyes and made a completely calm and unexpected invitation, and then walked away. I kept replaying it, the way she said it, the way she didn't flinch. The next couple of weeks were uncomfortable. I made excuses to not go over to Spencer's, which I had never really done before, and he noticed. He texted me a couple of times asking if I was good, and I said, "Yeah, work stuff," which wasn't entirely a lie, because the hardware store had me doing extra shifts going into the holiday season. But mostly I was avoiding the house because I didn't know how to act around Lorraine, and I didn't know how to explain to Spencer why. The truth was that something had shifted in how I thought about her, and I hated that it had, because it felt like a betrayal of something I couldn't quite articulate. Lorraine wasn't just a woman I found suddenly intriguing. She was Spencer's mother. She was the person who had signed his permission slips and driven us to hockey arenas at 7 in the morning and kept a photo of him from his first day of kindergarten on the fridge. There was no version of this that wasn't complicated. But I kept thinking about what she'd said. About a month after that Saturday, I ended up at their house to return a set of jumper cables Spencer had lent me. I figured he'd be home, but when I got there, his car wasn't in the driveway, only Lorraine's. I almost left. I sat in my car for a full 2 minutes debating it. Then I figured it would be weirder to drive away if she'd already seen me, so I went to the door. She answered in a paint-covered sweatshirt, a home renovation project apparently underway in the spare room. She looked surprised to see me, but not uncomfortable. She invited me in for coffee because she said she needed a break, and I couldn't think of a reason to say no that wouldn't sound strange. We sat at the kitchen table, and at first it was the same surface-level stuff. Work, weather, whether Spencer had mentioned the hockey pool he'd joined at the office. But then she asked how I was really doing, and something about the directness of it caught me off guard, and I ended up talking about the breakup, about feeling stuck, about the design program and how I kept starting things and not finishing them. She listened in a way that I wasn't used to, not offering solutions, not moving to reassure me quickly, just listening, and then she said something I've never forgotten. She said that she had spent most of her 30s believing that the right time for things would eventually arrive, and that by the time she figured out it wasn't coming on its own, she'd already let a lot of years go by. She said she wasn't telling me what to do with that. She just thought I should know, feeling like something had been rearranged inside me quietly without my permission. After that, it happened a few more times. Not planned, not arranged. Spencer would be out or upstairs on a call for work, and Lorraine and I would end up talking in the kitchen or on the back porch. Never long, never anything I could point to and say, "This is what this is." Just conversations that kept going somewhere real before I had time to stop them. And then one evening in late January, she said something that made me go home and not sleep at all. We were standing at the back door after I had shoveled her driveway, which I had offered to do because Spencer's back had been bothering him and there'd been a bad freezing rain the night before. She thanked me, and I said it was nothing. And then she said, quietly, that she thought I already knew I hadn't been coming around just to return jumper cables or shovel driveways. She said she wasn't someone who played games or pretended not to see things clearly, and she said that if what I was feeling was real, and not just something I needed to sort through, she was willing to have that conversation. Then she said goodnight and closed the door. I sat in my truck in her driveway for 10 minutes before I started the engine. I knew I had to talk to Spencer. I had known it for weeks. But knowing something and doing it are two completely different things, and I had been putting it off because I didn't know how to begin a sentence like that. How do you tell your best friend, your oldest friend, The person whose house you grew up in and whose mom packed both of you sandwiches on school camping trips, that you think you might have feelings for her? There's no version of that sentence that lands cleanly. I asked him to meet me for coffee at a Tim Hortons near his office on a Tuesday morning. It was February. The parking lot had not been properly plowed and there were dirty gray mountains of old snow pushed against the curb. And the coffee was too hot and I burned my tongue on the first sip, and I remember thinking, even my body is not ready for this. I told him there was something I had to say, and that it was going to sound strange, and that I needed him to hear the whole thing before he reacted. He let me get about 2 sentences in before his expression changed. I told him that I hadn't planned any of it, that it wasn't something I had gone looking for, that I understood completely if he was furious. I told him that his friendship meant more to me than almost anything in my life, and that I was terrified of what I was saying to him. And then I told him that somewhere in the last few months, without understanding how it happened, I had developed feelings for his mom. Spencer set down his coffee. He looked at me for a long moment without saying anything, and then he said, "I'm going to need you to not talk to me for a while." He left the Tim Hortons. I sat there for 20 minutes staring at the table. I paid for both coffees because it felt like the least I could do. The weeks after that were the loneliest I have ever felt. Spencer didn't block me, didn't make a scene, didn't say anything cruel. He just went quiet. He stopped texting back. He was civil when we ended up in the same space through mutual friends, but the warmth was gone and its absence was louder than anything he could have said. I stopped going to his house entirely. I stopped reaching out to Lorraine, who, from what I understood, also backed away from the situation to avoid making things harder between us. I had a lot of time to sit with my own choices that winter. I questioned everything, whether I had misread the whole thing from the beginning, whether Lorraine had simply been kind and I had turned it into something it wasn't, whether I had, in my own oblivious and selfish way, managed to damage the most important friendship of my adult life over something that might not even be real. There was a specific Saturday night in March where I sat in my apartment and ate leftover pasta and watched a hockey game I wasn't interested in and thought about calling Spencer and apologizing and telling him to forget the whole thing. I almost did. I picked up my phone and typed half a message and then deleted it. I didn't know what I was apologizing for. Feelings aren't something you can return. What I didn't know, because Spencer and I weren't talking, was what was happening on his end. He told me later, much later, that winter he had started noticing things about his mom's life that he had been too distracted to see before. How she came home on Friday evenings to an empty house and made dinner for one. How she had given up a potential promotion years ago because it would have required travel and he'd been too young for her to be gone. How she deflected questions about dating so automatically that he'd stopped asking. How she had quietly arranged her entire life around his, and how now that he was 25 and independent and doing fine, she was left with a lot of evenings and not much in them. He didn't tell me any of this at the time, he just went quiet with it. The call came in April, a Tuesday evening. I saw his name on my phone and I stared at it through 2 full rings before I answered. His voice was measured, not warm exactly, not the way it used to be, but not cold either. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he still didn't love this situation and he wasn't sure he ever would. He said he had some questions he needed answered honestly, about my intentions, about whether I had genuinely thought through what this would mean. I answered every question as honestly as I could, and then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "My mom has spent 25 years taking care of other people. If you hurt her, I will not forgive you. But if you can't figure out what you want, then leave her alone, because she deserves better than someone who's still deciding." He hung up. He hadn't said yes, but he hadn't said stop. I called Lorraine that same evening. We talked for almost 2 hours. I told her what I had told Spencer. I told her I had been afraid of what I was feeling because it seemed to come out of nowhere, but that the months of doubt and distance had only made it clearer, not less. I told her I knew this was complicated and that I wasn't expecting it to be simple. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she appreciated that I hadn't just disappeared, that disappearing would have been the easier choice. Our first real date was in May. We drove out to Elora on a Saturday and walked around the gorge and ate at a small restaurant on the main street that had a patio overlooking the water. We talked for 4 hours. About everything. About growing up, about what we each regretted, about what we were still hoping for. It didn't feel like a date in the nervous, performative sense. It felt like a conversation that had been waiting a long time to happen. I remember driving home on the 401 with all the windows down and the early summer air coming in and thinking, so this is what it's supposed to feel like. The next 2 years were not easy in every direction. There were tense family dinners around the holidays where Spencer's mood shifted in ways I recognized and tried not to make worse. There were moments between Lorraine and me where the age gap, 15 years, surfaced not as something either of us raised directly, but as a kind of ambient pressure, small decisions that reminded us we were coming from different decades of life experience. But there were also ordinary Thursday evenings in her kitchen, while she told me about difficult patients, and I showed her logo drafts I was working on. Because I had gone back to the design program and this time I was finishing it. There were Raptors games where Spencer eventually, grudgingly, let me sit beside him again. There were slow mornings at her place in the winter when the snow was coming down outside and neither of us had anywhere to be. There was the afternoon Spencer came over for dinner and we talked for 3 hours after we ate, the three of us at the kitchen table, telling old stories and laughing at things that used to be painful. And I looked across at Lorraine, and she caught me looking and said nothing. Just smiled, and I thought, I can't believe a stupid joke at a football game on a rainy Saturday is what led here. Lorraine and I have been together for over 7 years now. We got engaged 2 years ago in the fall, at a quiet spot near the water in Collingwood, just the two of us. Spencer was the first person we called. He picked up on the first ring. There was a long pause after I told him, and then he laughed, and it was the realest thing I had heard from him in a long time. He gave a speech at our wedding last summer that had half the room crying and the other half laughing, and somehow managed to land on true. He talked about how the hardest thing he ever had to do was let go of the version of his life where everything stayed exactly the way it was, and how he eventually realized that his mom was a person before she was a mother and that she deserved to be seen that way by someone. He looked at me when he said that last part. I am 32 years old now. I still work in graphic design, freelance, mostly, with a small client base that took me 4 years to build and that I am genuinely proud of. Lorraine is still at the clinic, though she's taken on a mentorship role now with newer hygienists. We have a house in Guelph with a backyard that is mostly garden because she wanted it that way, and I have learned more about perennials and soil pH than I ever expected to. Spencer comes for dinner most months. He and Lorraine bicker about the same things they always did, the way she reorganizes his dishwasher loading when she visits him, the way he leaves dishes to soak when he could just wash them, and sometimes, when the three of us are sitting in that kitchen after dinner with the radio on low and nobody needs to be anywhere, I think about that cold, wet Saturday in October, and the moment I said something stupid without thinking, and the silence that followed it. I used to think that silence was the sound of something ending. Now I think it was the sound of something becoming possible. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been surprised by where life led you, leave the word unexpected in the comments below. And if you're watching this for the first time, subscribe to Courage Stories, because the most honest moments usually begin with something we never planned to say.